Okay, so today we're going to be looking at energy in biomass. So first of all of the energy in a food chain comes from the sun, the sun's energy, the sun's light. And the reason for that is because the light energy is absorbed by the producers, the green plants and the algae, which will use that light energy for photosynthesis, and therefore some of that energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of glucose. And this glucose is stored in the plants as biomass. It can then be converted to things like starch, or it can be added to nitrates to make proteins. So really, the plants and the algae are the producers, but the source of that biomass, the source of that energy, has come originally from the sun. So in all food chains, the original source of energy is the sun. The definition of biomass, if you split up the word into bio and mass, well, bio means living, so it's the mass of living material, or the mass of biological material. We usually use dry mass because if you include water, the water content of each organism can vary quite a lot, so we use a dry mass. So actually only 1 to 3% of the sun's energy is converted into organic matter, such as glucose. And the reason for this is because some of the energy, some of the light will pass straight through the leaf. Some of it will be reflected off the leaf. Some of the light that hits the leaf might be the wrong wavelength. It might not hit the chlorophyll molecule in the right orientation. And there could be other factors which limit the rate of photosynthesis, like lack of carbon dioxide, too cold temperature, etc. So in a food chain, at the beginning of a food chain, there will always be the producer, which absorbs the light energy and turns it into glucose, turns this into biomass. So in my example of a producer here is an oak tree. Then you've got the primary consumer, which is a herbivore, could be an omnivore as well, but something that will eat the plants. So my example here would be the bark beetle. You've then got the secondary consumer, which eats the primary consumer. So this secondary consumer would either be a carnivore because it eats other animals, but it could also eat plants as well, in which case it would be an omnivore. Then you've got the tertiary consumer, which is at the top of the food chain. Well, you could actually get quaternary consumer, but in this case, this is our apex organism of the food chain, because it's the top of the food chain. So the barn owl is the top of this food chain, and it's the tertiary consumer. So in terms of the producer, that is in the first trophic level. The primary consumer is the second trophic level. The secondary consumer is the third trophic level, and the tertiary consumer is the fourth trophic level. And the direction of the arrows show the direction that the energy is transferred from one organism to the next. So we can use the different ways to represent what's happening in a food chain. So the first one that you can use is pyramids of numbers. So you would literally just count how many blades of grass there are, how many rabbits there are, and how many foxes there are in a certain area. So this would be your first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level. This would be your producer, your primary consumer, your secondary consumer. So producers always go at the bottom of the pyramids, and usually you have more producers than you do primary consumers than you do secondary consumers. So usually it would be a nice pyramid shape. However, this isn't always the case. So an example where this might not be the case is if, for instance, one oak tree, if you're purely counting numbers, well, one oak tree is absolutely massive, and it would actually feed many caterpillars, which will then feed a few less blackbirds, which will then feed a few less birds. But you can see that sometimes they have the potential to become skewed if you use just purely pyramids of numbers. So a better way of representing it would be pyramids of biomass, because you're actually measuring the amount of living matter in each trophic level at a particular place over a particular time. So you measure it in grams per metre squared to find it per area. So you find the dry mass in a certain area of living material. And it will always produce a pyramid shape because the mass is going to get less at each stage. And the reason that the amount of living material becomes less, or energy becomes less at each stage, is because at each stage there is always a loss of energy or a loss of biomass to the atmosphere, because either not all the organism is eaten at each stage, so things like the bones, the hair, etc. of a rabbit might not be eaten by a fox, and the cellulose might not be eaten by a rabbit. The cellulose of a plant cell wall. Also, at each stage, some of the material is passed out of waste as faeces or urine, and also a lot of the energy might be lost in respiration to release energy so that organism can move. So for muscle contraction, to build new material, not all of it will be used to build biomass. So,
I've got you some raisins.
Biomass.
Raisins to decorate
As I said before, not all of the biomass of a producer will be passed on to a primary
this one or that one?
consumer, because, for instance, herbivores might not be able to digest the cellulose of the plants. And for instance, as we said before, a fox might not eat all of the rabbit, it might not eat the bones, the hair. There might be undigestible, the teeth might be undigestible material, not all of the carnivore will eat. And also there might be some undigestible material lost in faeces, and some of the excess protein might be passed out as urea in the urine, so that energy is transferred to the surroundings rather than to the next trophic level. And as I said before, some of the biomass that is eaten by an animal might actually be used as in respiration to release energy for things like muscle contraction, for movement, for keeping an animal warm. If it's a warm-blooded animal, a lot of energy will be needed to maintain the body temperature. So I said much of the energy released from respiration will be used to heat the surroundings, especially if it's a warm-blooded animal. It will need to maintain its body temperature, so a lot of that energy will be used for that. And some of the energy from respiration will be used for muscle contraction. So mammals and birds are warm-blooded, so they will require more energy to keep them warm than things that are cold-blooded, such as fish and amphibians. You can show the energy losses using a Sankey diagram. So you can see that the energy from food, some of it will go to the next stage, which is the arrow that goes straight on, but a lot of it will be lost as faeces and urine. Some of it will be used during respiration to release energy for movement. Some of it will be used for respiration to release energy in the form of heat to keep the body warm. And that's the end of that section.